I wanted to continue, you know, for what we talked about last Sunday. And Sunday was the story of Hagar. And this is the story of El Roy, El meaning God, mighty, powerful. That's why El Shaddai is Almighty God. And this is something that I wanted to go back into. I know the text is so rich, and what I shared last Sunday is just one of the many things that we could learn when you read Genesis chapter 16. And I want to go back to that in verse 16. And this is the revelation of Hagar, of course, her encounter with God, and somehow her encounter put her in this new perspective about who God is. And let's read that in the New International Reader's Version and also in the ESV version. It says, she gave a name to the Lord who spoke to her. She gave a name because of her encounter with God. And I love that. And again, if you read the story of Moses, you read the story of Abraham, we're going to talk about that this Sunday. It's about people giving a name and God revealing himself and what they have experienced about who God is. And they would give a name of God. And she called him, you are the God who sees me. That's why in some translation it would say, you are El Roy. The God who sees me is the El Roy there. And because she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. And going to another translation in ESV, almost the same. But yet it says here at the very end, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, I have seen him who looks after me. So the one seeing is not just looking at you, but I think the ESV translated that beautifully when it says that I have seen who looks after me. And I think that's why El Roy is not just that's not the God who sees, but also a God who watch over, which is the right translation right here. Who looks after me. I don't know about you, but it's when you go through challenges and difficulty, that is something that is kind of like the question that you're asking, that who is watching over me, who has my back, pretty much. And to be more colloquial in using that terminology today, is that God has your back. That's what we're talking about here. So that being said, the story of Hagar, of course, is a story that all of us could relate to. Not just the story about suffering and also difficulty, but because of many things as we look at this. Because if you go to verse 1, you would see here, now Sarai, not Sarah yet, but Sarai, and Abram, not Abraham, okay, wife had borne him no children, but she said, I had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. In some translation would say slave. You have to understand the cultural dynamics that was going on here. This is not our present situation, present culture. They have slaves. And looking at verse 1, jumping to verse 13, you would see the jump from Hagar being a slave, which is, number one, she was a Gentile. She was not part of the covenant. But yet at the very beginning, you would see, at the end, you would see how that translated, Jen, from being out of the covenant, out of the promise, into someone that have encountered the Lord. It's just marvelous for me because, again, you expected that from Abraham. You expected that from Sarai or Abram. But for Hagar, it just reminded me of when I look at the story of us, that before, even by mere culture, we're Gentiles.
That's right.
We are not part of the covenant promise or the covenant of God. But yet, because of Jesus Christ, again, right, the righteous shall live by faith. Because of that, we were included. And I think this is very encouraging. And sometimes when we feel like we are outside and everybody's closer to God and we are not, but yet at the very end, and here's the second point, also that her being a Gentile, that God gave her a promise. Because when you read such an amazing promise here, because look at this and I'm jumping because we've read this last Sunday, and if you want to follow through, I encourage you to watch the YouTube. So here's what it is, and you look at this in verse 10 in chapter 16. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. Wow. What a promise. And now you're going to be with a child, of course, and the promise was Ishmael. And again, This is again a son born out of promise. Let me put that this way. Let me put it that way, because Isaac is the son of promise. Ishmael is not. Because what's inside of the womb of Hagar is still part of Abram. That's why God is taking care of that, because remember, he's a God of covenant. And even in Abraham's failure, let me put it this way, in Abraham's shortcut, God was still redeeming him. Wow. And I don't know about you, but if you think about that, and I think about myself, in all of the failure that I have incurred in my relationship with God, Jen.
Right.
I mean, but still, God has been faithful, pursuing, redeeming me in all of the mistakes that I have done, even in my pursuit of my walk with Him.
Yes, I agree. It's just I love what you said, that sometimes now that we are sons and daughters of God, sometimes we feel like, yes, the promise, we received the promise is for us, but we have to understand the promise wasn't for us at the very
Exactly.
beginning.
Yep.
We weren't part of the covenant promise, but then through Jesus Christ we were given that covenant promise. And it just brings me to the point where, well, I remember the first time when I didn't know God, and I cried out to Him desperately. And that's when God, came to my rescue. To be honest with you, if you're gonna look back at when you first experienced God in your life, it was in a time like where Hagar was,
Exactly.
in a moment of desperation,
Yeah.
a moment of really not knowing God. Maybe she knew or heard about God because of,
But it's not personal.
it
though.
wasn't
Yeah.
personal, because when she said, I have seen the God who sees me, she kind of knew there was a God, but it wasn't it wasn't personal to her.
Yeah.
And so if you just go back to that day and just picture the day when you first encountered God in your life, a lot of us would say, wow, that was a pivotal moment in my walk, because
Exactly.
God showed up, and that kind of changed my mindset of who God is in my life, because He revealed Himself to you in a very personal way. Yeah.
And I like what you said, Jen. That being said, of course, it's almost like when I look at the story of Hagar, it's a story of all of us.
That's right.
In that, in our moment of whatever desperation or difficulty or challenges or whatever you're going through, like Hagar, you cried out to God and He revealed Himself to you, to me.
Yes.
And that's why, and then He gave us a
And
promise.
gave us a promise. That's right.
So He gave us a promise, and the promise is not for anything else, a promise of eternal life, but a promise also of relationship.
That's right.
And then at the end, when you read this verse 13, if you're walking through this powerful story of Hagar, then truly I have seen Him. So for the first time, Hagar was saying, I have seen the God who's watching over me. So it's like, now it's personal. I've heard about this God. I've maybe, experienced it, but I have seen Him. And so many of us could say that now, that I have seen this God that I might have knew before, but yet I have. And look at what she said. Truly, I have seen the one who looks after me. So her perspective of who God is changed because of her encounter with God. Wow. So I believe that's why, here's my thing, Jen, and I believe that's sometimes we despise, difficulties and challenges, and we despise those difficult moments or great moments. But I think each and every encounter is precious, because
right.
in each and every encounter, if we have the right heart, if we're going to cry out to the Lord, I believe we would see God in a different perspective.
Yes, I agree. And that I think that's what's wonderful about our God. He reveals Himself to us. Little by little, we see more of who He is in our lives in personal ways. And if you're going to look at your journey in your Christian walk, you'd see how God has revealed Himself to you
Yes.
in different aspects. And I think sometimes we forget. I think that's the thing. We forget. And I think I love this moment of just going back and remembering, how God has really shown himself to us, revealed himself to us in a very personal way. And even if along the way, just like maybe Abraham, you're already a son of, you're
Yeah.
already in the covenant promise. But you know what? We mess up.
Like Abraham. Big time.
Yes, and when we mess up, it doesn't mean that there are no consequences just because we are children of the covenant. No, there are consequences to the failures, the decisions that we make.
Actually, more than that, it's the consequences because of the
This
disobedience. Yeah.
That's right. So there are consequences to our disobedience, and we are not exempted from that just because we are sons and daughters of the promise.
God would redeem us, but yet there's
That's
always
right.
a fruit of what the decisions that we make in life.
Exactly. And just like with Abraham made a decision, fruit of his disobedience, there's a consequence of the disobedience. But then God still in his sovereignty was redeeming, even
Because
the
again,
very
I like
failures.
what we talked about the last time, because God is long suffering. I think that's where it comes in, that he redeems us because he has his plan, and his plan is always perfect. And sometimes we veer away, but God in his grace and in mercy rescues us all the time. Let me just read this from Fatuma. Said our experiences with God during different times helps us see who God is. Yes, and I believe that. And I believe that when you experience having nothing,
Yes.
that's the time you see also, when you trust in him, that he's the God who provides.
That's right.
And so sometimes we don't hold on to that promise of him being a provider because you've never experienced lacking
Lack.
something. When you experience lack, and the only person or the only God you could hold on to is him, then you would understand this, that he would provide. Yes.